All right, welcome and happy Monday to everybody. It is good to see you all, and we have a lot to talk about, and I'm gonna, Gary and Phyllis, before we jump into today's topic, and people keep coming in here. A few things in the news I just would like to get your take, and anybody can, on the obviously I'm here and in chat can chime in. But one thing of note is the SolarWinds case. I don't know if you all saw, but the SolarWinds case was dismissed to a large degree by the U.S. District Court against the CISO, and therefore, where they appeared the SEC, and there was going to be, hell to pay for those executives. That is no longer the case. Did you see that, Phyllis and/or Gary? And
I did not. It was a pretty busy news weekend.
yeah, I know we have something else.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know we have other things to talk about. Chris, did you see that, or Matt?
No.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But now you said it, I'll go and research it because I would want to see what those findings were. Like, what's the? I don't really have an opinion unless I know kind of what the legal issues were, like a summary of the legal issues.
Right.
Of it.
Yeah, and what I can do, Gary, is once the chat gets underway, I'll put a URL in here for you to take a look at as well on the findings.
Yeah, look, there's some balance, right? There has to be accountability at the C-suite when things happen, these kind of effects. Balance with the things they control. It's technical, and there's got to be some balance. I don't know what it is, but I'd be interested in reading the detail.
Yeah. Okay. So I know we're going into the talk about CrowdStrike. To a degree, as I set the stage here, I'll talk about that. But Gary, I did some math, and in your famous words, this incident sounds expensive. Just to give you a sense, market cap loss is in the 23 billion right now since the announcement, based on share loss.
CrowdStrike?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would say of all the things of economic impact, that would be the smallest one.
Yeah.
I would put that like number 800 on the list of economic impact. Like, I can't wait till they tie a number to this, because it's going to be astronomical.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I just thought it was just interesting how punishing these things can be to an organization. Aside from the effect it had on airlines and all those other things, right? Just your own company's valuation is absolutely obliterated overnight. So those are the two things. So let me set the stage here, Gary, and then Phyllis, and we'll go into intros. So irony of ironies, right? I mean, last week we were talking about business impact analysis or assessment, depending on your, how you like to, use that that acronym. And then lo and behold, I wake up, Friday morning at about 5 a.m. and John Hammond his LinkedIn has got a zillion views, and he's been up all night long, following this. And I, reached out to him right away, started reading, the news, and obviously we all know what happened in terms of, there was this push of an update which provided Windows systems the blue screen of death. And although we'll talk about this a little bit today, ironies would have it that another irony is that it was awesome that we're having Matt Holland on today, the CEO of Field Effect, who will introduce himself. But being at the kernel level code and development, something Gary, you've done years of. This is something that Matt knows very well. So I thought it was interesting that Matt was going to join us and talk about, first foremost, what actually possibly happened with the code. And then we'll get into the I think the bigger thing here really is, what is it that we as MSPs can do to get better? This is, as I said in, one of the announcements, right? This is a Winston Churchill moment, right, Gary? Like, never let a good crisis go to waste, where we can, learn, because this is something, all the time. It's like, well, gosh, what are the chances of this happening? Right.
Yeah. And we're dealing with it. Did it happen from the good guys?
Yeah.
But what if it wasn't? What if the same thing would have happened from the bad guy? This would be a very different conversation today.
Yeah, it would be. Very, very true, Gary.
Scary one.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. So thank goodness for that. It wasn't a cyber attack. So with that, let's do some intros. Matt, first time on the CyberCall. Awesome to have you with us. If you could share a little about yourself and your background, and then we'll let Chris. Most people know Chris, but we will get right on into it and let Phyllis lead it on off. So Matt, take it away, and thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me on today, Andrew. So my name's Matt Holland, Field Effect CEO and founder. I think the relevant background to this discussion is I've been a Windows kernel coder my entire adult life. It's basically the only thing I think I know how to do well. Started the first part of my career at a three-letter.
So sorry for you, man.
Sorry for my wife. The first part of my career, I was at a three-letter intelligence agency here in Canada. I got to write low-level kernel code for very pointy end-of-the-stick systems, which consisted of large-scale deployments. A lot of these types of topics that will come up today. How do you do that safely? How do you do that in a way that doesn't cause denial of services? Second part of my career, co-founded an intelligence tradecraft company, same type of thing. A lot of kernel authoring, a lot of remote systems, a lot of remote debugging, handling the challenge of large-scale deployments and making sure you don't end up blowing things up. And I guess the third part of my career is here at Field Effect, where we're clearly an MDR provider for MSPs to service small to medium businesses, and one of our components is an endpoint agent. So this is, as I said, kind of my bread and butter. So really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you joining. Mr. Lair, thank you as always for coming on.
No, happy to be here. Yeah, Chris Lair with Solace, or also people know us as Solace Security, based here in Austin, Texas.
It's actually pronounced Lure.
No, that's not correct. We'll have
I checked
next
it.
time
It's
we see you
Lure.
in person. If you're German, you say Lure. But you have to say that with a lot of emphasis and strength in your vocal cords. But anyway, happy to be here. MSSP is a response firm, and I have to admit on this one, I was glad to be watching it from the sidelines.
I bet, Chris. I bet. All right, Phyllis. Awesome to have you with us as always. I'll let you take it away here, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, Matt, as always, we like to start off the call with just kind of level setting for the group, for those of the folks who haven't been keeping up to date or perhaps don't know what happened. So CrowdStrike, I think we all know, updated their software. Maybe it was a kernel level file. And of course, you just said you have a lot of experience with kernel level programming. So can you actually explain to us what happened? As much as you know.
Yeah, I'll give it my best shot, because CrowdStrike's been pretty vague on technical details for, I think, pretty obvious reasons at this point. So what happened was on Friday, they sent out an update, and that update was a configuration file for their Falcon endpoint agent. From my understanding, when the endpoint agent read in that configuration file, an instability occurred. It looks like a memory allocation or issue there. And what happened was every machine that received this update crashed. Now, the real kicker is when Windows automatically rebooted, the Falcon agent would start again, read the configuration file, and crash again. And this type of circular crashing is like literally the worst case scenario for an endpoint company. So, I feel for CrowdStrike because this is definitely a tough one to get out of. Now, the file itself, even though it was named .sys, it was a .sys extension. It was a configuration file, and I think that's something that it's important to be really clear on. It wasn't a separate driver file that was being loaded. From what I read, the configuration file itself controlled policy information for monitoring and restricting access to named pipes on Windows, which is why this is a Windows-only problem. The reason you would typically monitor named pipes would be for signaturing, classes of malware. So this is something that is a really nice way to detect Cobalt Strike, for example. They have typically a set of named pipes that doesn't get changed too often. That is a really easy way to detect Cobalt Strike on host. Another reason would be to potentially detect RPC exploitation, which is a whole class of exploits, or even kernel level exploitation. Basically running a privask because you can run memory grouping techniques via named pipe grouping. So different reasons why you would want to monitor these things. From what I can tell, the fact that corruption got through, or that corrupted file got through, points to a problem either at the QA phase. We were chatting earlier before, it might have been a corruption in transit. But I think largely it's kind of moot at this point because clearly there was a breakdown along the way there.
Yeah. I just this is a little bit off script, but what's funny, as you were talking, and my coworker and I, my boss Kurt, who's been on here before, were sending emails back and forth on, some of the articles were blaming Microsoft, for the failure, which I thought was pretty comical. And then Microsoft was like, "It's not us. It's not us." So, in the beginning, I think it was just hard, for.
Well, I think the damage has been done though, because you still see a lot of on the mainstream media articles, they still are combining those two entities together and everything that they mentioned.
Yeah.
And Chris, do you mind? I'm going to put this in chat, but you had an interesting point about Microsoft and the EU. I thought that was interesting. I'm going to put this in chat for everybody.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I saw this come out, and basically the question had been posed to Microsoft, says, well, why don't you have the same restrictions on your OS that something like Mac OS does, to where this doesn't happen? And Microsoft's, and Andrew's posting a link to the article, where Microsoft says, hey, our agreement with the EU, and it's probably from a anti-competition perspective, was to allow this to happen. So we have to allow vendors to have this access in order for this to do that. So we can't restrict this, unfortunately. So I thought that was really interesting.
Chris, isn't this why Windows is dominant? The same reason it's dominant, because people they leave it so open, is the same reason there's all this risk, right?
Well, I mean, that's somewhat the argument that people made with Android phones, right? But I think it's Microsoft's market share is their market share, and it's always been adopted by the business, and that's not going to change. I mean, Mac has eaten in a little bit of that, but not enough to cry over. So I don't necessarily think it's Microsoft's willingness to be more open. I do believe them in this particular situation, just with the advances over the last 5 or 6 years and the focus on security. I have to give them the benefit of the doubt on this one, that they might have not allowed something like this to go on if they didn't have this agreement in place with the EU. Now, I will tell you, Microsoft is not free of blame, because I was talking to some Microsoft people during this event, right? And so obviously on the Azure side, it was very painful for people. And so people were jumping in there and rebooting, their Azure VMs and all that type of stuff. And services like DHCP on the Microsoft side couldn't handle that load. So not to say that Microsoft, I think it's kind of interesting that Microsoft didn't load test this with their size and their capabilities for for an event like this.
An important thing to note, just a consideration on the access to the kernel piece. There's only 2 operating systems in the world where a defender is actually on the same playing field as an attacker, and that's Windows and that's Linux, because you can run kernel components. I spent a significant portion of my career actually being the attacker. On Mac OS, they used to allow kernel access, and now you can run a user mode extension. And that position makes it significantly more difficult to actually truly defend a Mac host. Same thing with Android and iOS. Like as an attacker, as soon as you get a full exploit chain running on those devices, there's no way to stop it. And I think that's an easy thing to kind of, not take into consideration just in the world, because, there's a lot of pressure to lock down operating systems. But at the end of the day, the attacker will have the upper hand if you do not have that same level of execution. The other side effect that we've observed on Mac with them pushing it to a security extension in user mode is the performance hit on the operating system itself is considerably higher. When you're executing in the kernel, you can look at things in real time, and obviously you have to be very responsible with your processing to make sure you don't cause more harm than good. But on Mac, to do that same type of monitoring, the CPU penalty is considerably higher. Take a look. I'm just going to throw this out as an experiment for later. Take a look if you have a Mac box, how much CPU that Microsoft Defender takes up on Mac. It's pretty substantial, to the point where running 2 security agents on a Mac device will cause a really, really significant penalty and make it not a fun experience for users. Whereas you could run 3 or 4 on Windows, and providing they're all doing what they're supposed to be doing, the user experience isn't bad.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was funny you said that, Matt, because I saw when this thing first broke, a lot of people were making the argument, this is why you should run on Linux. This is why you should run on Linux. And the smart people were jumping in saying, not so fast, my friend.
So, Matt, I know we covered this, but did you did say there was a breakdown in how the update was pushed. Did you want to add anything to that before we move on, or?
Yeah, I think the breakdown, I think, we had a conversation beforehand, and understanding where the breakdown occurred. I think it's going to be a bit of a moving story a bit, but if they tested on their own networks at the very least, they probably would have caught this. And that, I think, if you're an endpoint agent vendor, you have to dog food your own product. You have to have your company use it and ensure there's no issues. You were saying prior that it might have been a corruption in transit. I mean, that itself is preventable as well, just by signing files and having, when a file is loaded and configuration is loaded, verifying the signature is not broken. That is a very preventable scenario. Staged releases, that's another thing. Every endpoint company should be doing staged rollouts. We have a group of customers, group of partners who want to see things sooner than later. So you can have like early adopters, or just something as basic as when you press go, just do 5% on day 1, see how things are. So the fallout of this problem, regardless of where the technical breakdown, could have been mitigated just by some very simple and I think responsible rollout procedures.
Right. Thanks for that. So go ahead.
I was going to say, it'll be interesting to hear, Matt, what the counter to that is, because that's the obvious answer, and whether they present a counter, because it's pretty strong. I mean, in my time on a small scale of running MSPs, we never rolled out anything, not even a patch, right? Like that's like a golden rule. So I'll be anxious to hear as this debriefs.
Yeah. I think the counter would be, the job of a cybersecurity company is to protect customers, and these types of regular updates, like I think Phyllis, you said earlier, they release updates to this file once a day, and I think that's a very common thing to do if you're running an endpoint agent where you're updating EDR policies or signatures or whatever that looks like. So that is a critical part of actually keeping your customers protected, staying ahead of threats, keeping up with threats, doing whatever you need to do to proactively protect customers. So I think that's why it occurs so quickly. But if you're doing something that aggressively, you need to have mechanisms in place that assumes you have bugs. And regardless of what those mechanisms are, it just needs to be an operating cadence. I suspect CrowdStrike they've been successful. Like they're a hugely successful company. They've been doing this for many years. So they probably had a lot of confidence in this mechanism that it was stable and good. But even, if it did turn out to be a corruption in transit, just verifying the signature of that file when it loads would do the trick. If you look at how Microsoft Defender works, the way they load signatures is by using a .sys file, but they load that file the same way you'd load a driver, and it's digitally signed. So it's something that the operating system can just verify. So if somebody messed with it, it just wouldn't load. So there are things you can do to mitigate situations like this.
Yeah, thank you for that. So over to you, Chris. So as you know, the majority of MSPs and MSSPs are signing contracts with software manufacturers, and then they just, bake in those solutions like CrowdStrike into their tech stack. And so then the customer, of course, is buying the end result. So luckily, in this case, there's so much press with CrowdStrike. Most organizations aren't pointing the finger at their MSP or MSSP. But having said that, what should MSPs be doing for the next time, in case this happens again, before signing a contract with a software vendor to protect themselves and make sure that they're not the ones end up being held liable, or the finger is pointing at them?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and I think this is something that's difficult to pick up in any type of vendor due diligence, right? When you're an MSP or an MSSP and you're looking at vendors, and CrowdStrike's one of the top dogs out there. They've been doing it for a long time. They have the financial strength, they have the track record. Obviously, you could see all the major companies and organizations and government entities and everything that use it. So you're like, hey, this is a product that I completely trust. I think one of the things that a lot of clients may not even know that they're running CrowdStrike, right? As MSP or MSP, you might be providing products and packages, and you may have told them at one point they were CrowdStrike, but it probably went one ear out the other. So a lot of times you have some explaining to do when these types of situations occur. And I think from a contractual perspective, I think that's a good conversation with someone like, I know Eric, he's not on the call today, but with Eric Tildes, he makes sure that the language is correct in those contracts, that from an MSP, MSSP perspective, that if there's any type of language that needs to flow through, meaning that there's requirements that come from the vendor side that need to be in the MSP contract and vice versa, that those are in there and that they're called out. So from a legal perspective, you're good. But ultimately, you're right about the situation being so, a big part of the news. It's going to be tough for people to say, hey, MSP, this is your fault. But I do think that from not from a legal perspective, but more from just kind of stepping up, you are it, right? And so from an MSP perspective, you got to be figuring out in these types of situations, you're going to have to explain it. You can't just punt and say,
Right.
well, pay attention to the news and just take your direction from CrowdStrike. I know a lot of the guidance coming out was like, hey, just go to CrowdStrike's portal and look for direction there. Well, we all know as MSPs that our clients don't have access to that portal per se. And so we're still going to have to be that mechanism to communicate and have to do so in an effective way. And in this case, they don't have their PCs available, most likely. So you're going to have to figure out other ways to communicate that to them.
But if you think about it, it's a reason why half the Fortune 500 use CrowdStrike. Because I don't think because of that, they're so big, it's on the news. I don't think any CTOs are getting fired today from Fortune 500s. Another choice of a different company that wasn't on the news cost them their job.
That's exactly right.
Or
I mean,
wrong.
It goes back.
Not a technical thing or what's better for the business. It's just like the political reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think number one is it's like the old adage, you don't get fired for choosing IBM. And I think that pertains here, right? I don't think it would be very hard to find a way to blame, though I've worked at places where they would figure out a way to blame you, but they'd be very hard for a way to blame you.
People on this call don't know what IBM is.
Yeah, I know. Go look it up. But it's that thing in your grandpa's closet at the top. But anyway,
at least you didn't say Big Blue. If you said Big Blue, then Big Blue. People would be totally lost.
Well, you see those Watson commercials that are on TV. That's IBM. But anyway,
yeah.
The point is yeah, you're exactly right about it. But I do think that and we don't need to get into the side, but I know that Elon Musk said, hey, replace it. And I was talking to Andrew about that earlier, and he think, well, that's kind of maybe a little bit extreme. But I said, but I've worked at places where they wouldn't have blamed me for this, but they would have definitely told me to rip it out. and figure out a replacement pretty quickly. So I can definitely see a lot of CTOs, CIOs getting that direction to say, hey, I don't care, these guys are big or whatever, we can't go through this again. We need to send a message, find something
I would
else.
say now you're least likely to go through it with them. They're probably the company that'll have the best procedures starting in a few weeks.
That's what I've
Yeah.
always said too about these things. Yeah. They're the
There's
least likely
also,
person on earth to repeat this event. Yes.
yeah. And I think, I'll paraphrase Eric. I wish he was here to speak about this, but to the question, Phyllis, I think, it's a really important, that again, MSPs on the margin have blindly signed agreements, and they really need to look at, what the terms, are in that contract. Is the vendor solely saying, look, no matter what, we're not going to be held liable to our code releases and malfunctions and this and that and the other? Because some of them do say that, which then you are in essence holding the bag for all remediation downstream of this. So, again, simply the point I want to make sure MSPs are taking into account is stronger third-party risk management, stronger due diligence in their processes, and the latter part of this whole CyberCall is really about what we can do to get better on the margin for large-scale crisis like this.
Right. I think that's a great point, because a company like CrowdStrike, because of how big it is, because of its footprint, is going to react very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be that pressure, and not every vendor is going to feel that. And so that brings more to light, that previous question of, you really do have to get your ducks in a row, because
Yeah, and MSPs are quick to change off something they have to go to some startup, right? And that I see out there, they have an agent and something that they do, and I know their average, MRR to their customers is like $250 a month, and I'm like, okay, well, there's no way that can stay healthy and secure, right? Like, it's a math problem. And so I think it's more balancing. It's not just the tech you see. There's a whole bunch of things that go into now what risk management looks like for an MSP.
Yeah, very true, Gary. It's dramatically different than when we started 5 years ago doing the CyberCall, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think making decision on stack is a strategic decision today. And many MSPs that I deal with still look at it and vet things in a technical way, the same way they always did. And I'm not saying that tech shouldn't have any input. There maybe is, when you're doing an evaluation, there's certain red flags they're looking for. But if you're letting your tech team decide what tools you should use, you are going in the wrong direction fast. And I apologize to any technical resources on the call.
Yeah.
Not that it's not valuable, the input, but it's not the only input, man.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. It's part of the input, right, Gary? It's
yes,
and it's multiple players have to be involved, not just, hey, I'm going to absolve. Oh, if my techs like it, great.
I mean,
I was on a call with someone about this a few weeks ago. They ended up getting offended by me, which is hard to believe, isn't it?
Well, can we just stop this call for a minute? I can't.
In my defense, they were wrong.
No, we used to have this.
And I'm not offended, so it's okay.
Yeah. We used to have this discussion at the NSA where everyone would be like, Linux is so great. How come we don't have Linux? It's more secure than Windows, this, that, and the other. But, the reason why the government didn't want to have open source is because they're like, who do we call? Where's the SLA if there's a security incident? And everyone's like, it's more secure because it's open source and it's had more eyes on it. But it really was, I want to call somebody. I want an SLA, because if we can't perform our mission within a certain amount of time, you're getting requirements from the executive office, from the Department of Defense, from the IC, all these things. It's like, it's really critical. And so that's, I think that's the point here is like, you have SLAs with your customers. And so when you go to build your tech stack, all those SLAs have to match up. And that's what we talked about last week, right? was like, make sure everything is matching so that you can honor what you're telling your customers.
I think it's more defensible as well, right? I mean, think about it from the worst case. If you have to go to court, you got to sit in front of a jury. You're going to sit there and make an argument that you went with some open source solution that's been around for 6 months and you really liked what it did and they had a good color scheme for their branding, or does it sound better when you adopted something like CrowdStrike from that side of things? I mean, in our business, especially in the service provider business, that's what it kind of comes down to. You have to be able to defend yourself, defend your decisions. And it's much easier to defend a decision with a known entity that has a solid track record than it is to unfortunately with a startup that may actually have better technology, but it's going to be hard to defend.
Right. So just one quick last question, Chris. I know you work in IR, and this kind of dovetails nicely into it. We're talking about when you respond to something, let's say you're an MSP with 100 clients running Windows and CrowdStrike, end result in terms of restoration and scale are similar to like a ransomware event or a DOS event. What should MSPs or MSSPs doing as far as like a tabletop exercise and how they can actually prepare for an incident like this?
Yeah, and I'd like to get Matt's perspective too, because they do IR as well. But I would say from our perspective, from a tabletop exercise, you need to be thinking about the ransomware scenario is somewhat similar in that it's going to involve you communicating a lot via mechanisms that you typically don't communicate. You're going to make an assumption that they may have phones only, they don't have their business computers. There may be an option at some point for to use something else or whatever. I could tell you, like in schools is a good example. There's pros and cons. When a school gets hit, that sucks. But a lot of schools have Chromebooks, and Chromebooks usually aren't impacted by this type of stuff. So they have some alternate means to actually get online, access their SaaS apps, and do that type of stuff. But my point is that depending on your client base and who you are, from a tabletop exercise perspective, you need to do an incredibly super heavy test around communications. Who's going to be communicating? How you're going to be putting together the message. I mean, I was even critical on our side when this thing came out, and Matt had mentioned the fact that this was a config file and not a driver file, and early indications to me is like, this didn't seem like a driver file, even though it looks like a driver file, it doesn't smell like one. And so people were putting out messaging about it being a driver. I would say, hey, don't go to that degree. That hasn't been verified. You could say it was a bad update, a bad file. There's a lot of things you can put on there without getting that specific. So that's the types of things that you need to work out in your comms on what to say, what not to say, to what detail, what things can you say that you feel confident that you can say without having an attorney or someone else wordsmith. And then also in your organization, who are the potential employees that may say the wrong thing? Who are the employees that say have diarrhea of the mouth, that are just going to go off and do their own opinion or do those types of things? I mean, it happens. I see it more often than not, right? People get on a conversation and they just get rolling and you can't stop them. And so understanding who you should let talk and who you shouldn't let talk is also very important. So you can do an IR tabletop just around comms and it'd be incredibly effective.
Chris, before we go to Matt, again, irony, we had Clark Harshbarger, who is the head of IR for CrowdStrike on about a year and a half ago. But one thing he did say, which I thought was really important, is just your comms chain, your people. Like if you had an all Windows environment and that was your IR plan and all your phone, tree was in a Windows system, what are you doing? So, Gary, you've said many times, like, you better have that in a good place too. But, I think all too often, we're not here to cast, FUD and doom, but look, again, these are real situations. Like, who would have thought the CrowdStrike incident, right? Who would have thought a CDK, and that could have been our PSA, a cloud provider's PSA with 15,000 MSPs down. These incidents are happening. So we need to do something.
I also think that this is a great example. This is in the middle of summer, and there were tons of people stranded at airports. how many of the MSPs out there had people that were traveling or may have been critical that were stranded at airports and wouldn't be at work or couldn't work or whatever the case may be. So that's another factor that you could blend into your IR tabletop. Say, hey, I'm missing critical people. What do I do about it? How do I work around that?
Right. Right. Really
Yeah.
good point.
I mean, there's,
Can I just, before your next question, Phyllis, Chris and Matt, I want to ask a question because I've been having this conversation with MSPs recently because we did this like tool stack study. And one thing I noticed, the two things that came out of it were most MSPs didn't have MDR everywhere, that they had endpoints for a bunch of reasons, pricing being the main thing. But also the minority of them had endpoint backup, like on every endpoint. And the idea was, well, we don't need to back up every workstation. How do you guys feel about it? Like in this kind of scenario, had it not turned out this way, wouldn't you want to be able to have a backup of workstations as well as servers?
Or am
I not looking at it right?
Well, I think it depends. It might be a per organization scenario because, depending if they're working off shared drives, the amount of storage that each individual workstation has locally, it might vary per organization. It's a really good thought. I might have to think on that one a little bit.
I was saying like from a restore standpoint of options.
Well, here's my thought is I think it's interesting because there's two ways to look at this. Number one, you could say, hey, I have everything built out in some system. Let's just call it Azure for sake of argument. So if a machine does go down, there's really nothing on the machine that needs to be restored. Somebody can connect back into Azure, pull down their image, their apps, and they're back up and running. Well, that's great, except for if Azure is running like a dog because everybody's hammering the living crap out of it, that's going to be an issue. But I've always leaned more on, hey, let's try to keep stuff off the workstation and make it as to where you don't have to back it up. Now, there are backup solutions out there for the workstations, but those backups for those workstations basically you can spin up a virtual session of that workstation in the cloud. So, I mean, it kind of comes down to a cost benefit perspective is, are you going to, if you don't want to do something in the cloud and you want to do some kind of local backup solution for desktops, how much is that going to cost? And does that make it worth remediating the risk that way? So it's a tough one. I think when you work through this stuff, the situation did stink. But if you're able, for most cases that I'm in today's world, if you can get somebody a computer with a working browser on it, it's amazing how much work they can accomplish with that. Yeah, they might be missing some files that they need because they saved them on the desktop and they shouldn't have been doing that. But the SaaS apps, getting the webmail, all that type of stuff is there. And I think that's where if you could focus your plan on what does somebody need from a minimum perspective, and you guys talked about this last week with business impact analysis, what do our people need from a minimum perspective from an OS browser? Can they do 70, 80% of their work? I think that's a better plan than trying to figure out a full scale desktop backup and restoration process.
Yeah, good stuff, Chris.
Yeah, over you, Gary.
Matt, you heard earlier Andrew was quoting Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste, which, by the way, if you get to London and you can go down and see where Churchill ran the war from, I happened to be there last month and got to go do that. It's definitely worth the time and the story that they tell with it. But so we talked about like tabletops, but what are some other key points MSPs should look to improve crisis management, in the light of what we saw happen Friday?
Yeah, I think Chris's last answer, I think it sums up the operational perspective pretty well. When this was going down, I remember thinking to myself, this is just like an IR prep. Like you have your entire organization or the key people go through some sort of IR prep like training to be ready for an incident like this. The one thing I think where this would extend a little bit differently than IR prep is this might extend out into the vendors that you use as well. And can you build a relationship or an operational plan in case something goes wrong? Like what is your endpoint company's plan, what is your cloud protection plan, and work with your vendors to perhaps get something in place that is a little bit more tangible beyond what you might think you'd be in control of day one. Other areas I think would probably be more on the business side. Like the fallout from this entire incident is going to be quite interesting to see. Are there new insurance categories? Cyber insurance wasn't really a thing 10 years ago, and then it was. And is third party technology disaster insurance going to be something that arises? And there might be some existing insurance options there that an MSP could explore. Another thing might be how you do your budgets. I mean, this is outside of the world of cyber, but how do you have a line item that captures risk around utilizing third-party service or technology? It's similar to the concept of churn. Like most companies, when you do a budget, you'll have a line item in there that captures what your expected churn might be over the course of a year. And this might be something that's worth adding as a de-risking mechanism as you're doing your budgets, for example.
Gary, can I just chime in? Because
when you say your budgets, you mean our customers' budgets, because it's really our budget's determined by what they're willing to spend, right?
No, I mean the MSP's budget. So if you're, whatever your, I've never run an MSP, so I don't know the complexity of what an MSP's budget looks like. But there might be some, assuming you have investors and you're accountable for numbers, a line item in there just capturing that, if something goes wrong and there's business loss because of it, it might be worth having that sort of line item in there that would be similarly categorized as.
I'm with you. I think that's smart. I guess my point on it was we're funded by our customers. Mm-hmm. So anytime we're going to add expense items, we got to figure out how we fund them, and we fund them through our customer relationships. That's why it gets complex. But I'm with you, Matt, 100%. What were you going to say, Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Gary. As I think about this, Matt made a point about your suppliers, your vendors, but what about Gary, again, your customers, contracts you have to your customers. I mean, these are now you hopefully we'll do some you'll do your one-on-one role play a little later if we have some time, but I mean, how are you kind of using this again as a wedge where, people are like, well, I really don't need to talk about, adding additional things or going through these tabletops. But the reality is, Gary, if you were running CrowdStrike and you were a 100% Windows environment, let's just say, and you had things to fulfill to customers, that isn't happening on Friday. It may not be happening today based on the ability of where you sit in that MSP's food chain to get up and running.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the great part about this story is because it was an issue created by a company that defends cyber attacks, right? You can say, like, look, in this instance, this was this kind of mistake, but here's what the impact was. Had it not been that, had it been this, you can extrapolate out like the impact of that to every customer to say, look, no matter what we're doing, like this is the best, to me, discussion you can have to clearly paint, Andrew, what we've been talking about for years, which is have your customers have a assume breach mentality. Because the feedback we get is not all customers are there. Once you get a customer fully understanding that that's the world we live in, they're going to make investments, right? Assuming you can help them and their business and you've done a BIA, because they may not even be qualified to make good decisions unless we help them get there. But assuming we do those kind of things, to me, this is one of the best stories that we have on top of all the others to have that conversation.
Well, it's
I
great,
think,
Gary.
real quick. Sorry, I'll go ahead, Andrew. Yeah. And then I want to.
Yeah, I was just to say the reason I think it's so important and so great, Gary, is because again, people are always resistant about doing more around security controls or policies or this, that, or the other. You're showing them, look, this wasn't a cyber attack, but look at the impact, the economic impact to transportation, hospitals, or your business, whatever said business was.
If it was a cyber attack, we'd be having everything would still be down today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we would not know the information that we know today either.
No.
We would know as a cyber attack because no one was telling us anything. What I was gonna this is to me this is more of a disaster recovery type situation. But
Mm-hmm.
what I think the conversation to have with your customers, especially those impacted or those that may have had somebody close to them, like a supplier, somebody impacted, is this is business interruption in its purest form. And this
Yeah.
is where I think it's a great opportunity to understand and help your customers understand what business interruption is. And this is where I see this is really what I want to see. I'm going to follow for weeks to come because, like, who's going to pony this up, right? So if your clients have cyber insurance, the only thing they're going to, when they go in there wasn't a cyber attack, but it was, quote, cyber related, right? So, cyber insurance doesn't mean it has to be a cyber attack. It just means something technologically happened to cause this, right? In most cases. So they had some type of business interruption. Well, what does that mean? That means you truly, like, you lost hard money. It's not because if your employees are just sitting around accumulating pay, that's one thing. That's not going to count. But if there was true business that you lost as a result of being down, like the airlines had the perfect example. And somebody said there was an interview with one of the airlines that was impacted. And by law, they have to extend these vouchers out to everybody, right? So they're like, well, who's going to pay for that? And the guy, the spokesman for the airline goes, well, somebody's going to pay for it. And it's not going to be us. So the point is, it's like this whole business interruption concept. And when the insurance companies get involved and when they start kicking in and start wanting what we call subrogate, going after other policies, that's where things are going to get kind of interesting and kind of tricky to see how these things go on. I think it's going to take a while for it to be figured out. But for you to have your small customers, they need to understand, hey, this is a real deal. You're going to be interrupted. In the grand scheme of this CrowdStrike thing, you're a very small piece of and you have some big giant companies that are going to get their piece first. So they need to understand, number one, how they need to handle this. Number two, what can they do to kind of sustain business if their systems are down? And number three is to make sure that they understand what business interruption is, that they can calculate that. So when it comes time to provide evidence that they indeed lost business, that they can do that. And they're not trying to have to figure that out after the fact.
Yeah, great stuff, Chris.
So, Matt, I have like a two-part question for you after we've seen things like Snowflake and CDK, now CrowdStrike. So, in terms of how you look at it from a vendor and things you put in place when you look at mass outages, and then with that, like, so your personal experience, and with that, what are a few questions you think an MSP should be asking any vendor that has this potential?
Yeah, so a big part of my weekend was spent thinking about how this entire incident is going to change things for the industry, for companies like Field of Fact, endpoint companies. And I think ultimately it'll change things for the better because, it's very easy for an MSP to ask a vendor a question. And typically what you hear is a yes or a no. So, for example, a question somebody might ask now is, do you do staged rollouts? And the vendor might say yes or no. But I don't think you should stop there. And I don't think that's the type of questions MSPs should be asking. I would demand details. So instead of asking things like, do you do staged rollouts? I would say, give me your staged rollout plan. And what are the gates and the criteria for accepting rollouts at each step of the way? Don't ask questions like, how many versions of Windows do you test on, for example? Give me the full list of Windows versions that you test with. And if you don't see something that has like every patch iteration for the past 5 years as part of the standard QA, I mean, that's a red flag. Things like what's the background of your developers? Where do they come from? Where are they physically located? That can address anything from whether you've got a company staffed with juniors or hardened Five Eyes professionals who have dealt with much harder problems or similar problems. That's a big deal, and I think it's getting to the crux of like the DNA of what a company is and how they conduct business and what's important to them. Another one, describe your operational infrastructure. does all my data or my customers' data go to the cloud? What cloud provider is it? We've seen, cloud providers will go down every once in a while. What's the impact to your business? So I think my best advice would be ask for detail, ask for policies and plans that show the DNA of the company, and that they've actually got systems in place and they care about these types of things.
That's
Yeah,
really
what
that's
they're
really
willing
good.
to share, what they're willing to share tells you a lot too, and what they're not willing to share,
Yeah.
it tells you a lot. So
Strand, speaking of the SolarWinds incident early on, that's exactly what Strand was talking about many years ago. Gary, remember, he was like, if they're not willing to, share how they, do their pen testing and their coding, and they're proud of their, how they do their secure coding and how they, do their design, run for the hills, and so I think that's what you're saying, right, Matt?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it should be
Well,
something
the
that
best,
a vendor is proud of, and they should be
yeah,
excited to share this information with you.
yeah, the best ones are the ones that say, yeah, we run in AWS. You go, okay, and then they point you to AWS's compliance page. No. I know that. I want to know what you do with your stuff that's in AWS.
Right.
So a lot of them will do that.
I keep my DR plan on a microfiber that I use to clean my glasses, so it's always with me. It's foolproof. Chris, I want to ask you a
Yes.
question here. So we know there be phishing as a result of this, right? People
Oh,
registering
God,
newly
everything.
registered CRWD domains, other trade crafts. So can you talk a little bit about this and what MSPs can do to mitigate this? Because it'll happen pretty fast, right?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is MSPs need to get communications out to their clients saying, you're going to get communications about this, ignore them all, or at least let us know, you know what I mean? So you can take that sort of precautions. But like you should, as a client of ours that, let's say, for example, uses CrowdStrike, you're never going to get any emails directly from CrowdStrike because they don't even know your email address. So I'd be very clear about those types of things, of what they don't need to be falling for those scare tactics or whatever's doing things. Same thing with phone calls. I would be very clear with them about phone calls. I'd tell them, I'd instruct my clients to make sure that the word gets out to their staff as well, because sometimes you might send an email to 1 or 2 points of contact at that particular location or that particular client. They don't get the word out to everybody else. So I'd be very clear about the fact that, hey, you're going to most likely, there's going to be both very widespread and targeted type communications to try to bait you into doing something. And you're not, if you see any of those, let us know, but those are not, those are things that you should not be falling for.
Yeah. And someone just said that the sites were out on Friday morning. I guess teams are so mature, and with the help of AI, the turnaround time to take advantage of these kind of things is literally, there's almost no window now, right?
No window. I mean, I saw there's an article last week or a couple of weeks before where there was a vulnerability announced for some platform, and Cloudflare saw it being exploited 22 minutes after it was made public. So there is no time, and that's somebody writing tools to take advantage of the exploit. In this particular case, you got these enterprises that are doing these scam organizations located all over the planet, and they're perfectly geared, ready to take advantage of these situations, spin up whatever they need to do, and just go at it. I mean,
Yeah.
they're going to go at it 24/7.
We touched on this a little bit. Chris, can you just share any other nuggets around crisis management, not just for the MSP, but these kind of conversations you get from this that could get promoted from the MSP with their customers?
Meaning, like
using this as to have a different kind of conversation about where they are with crisis management and where they need to be.
Yeah, I think this crisis management, in my view, there's two. There's the macro and the micro. And obviously the macro is the stuff that you need to figure out, like I talked about earlier, what's the right thing to say to your entire audience, how to communicate that thing. But you're going to have specific things that you need to say to specific clients. So, I mean, I think it may be a little bit simpler if you are a vertically focused MSP, like in healthcare, maybe a little bit easier for you. versus if you're an MSP that has a spread of different industries and sizes of clients. But that crisis communication to your clients is one thing, but this is a good opportunity for you to work with your clients so you can learn together, and they can use maybe some of the same concepts that you're bringing to the table for their clients, or they may have a handle on crisis communication and how they handle things can be a benefit to you. So I think it's a great kind of mutual learning opportunity between your clients around this crisis communication, because for us as MSPs, we have to deal mainly B2B, but a lot of your clients may be B2C. And so there's some lessons you can learn from how they have to communicate to individuals versus from company to company.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I was looking at we're preparing for our peer meetings this week, looking over some people's numbers and whatnot. And one of the things I see also when I'm looking to acquire MSPs, and I look at their client distribution, and I look at what their average billing rate is, like how much per month average per client. But then you look at the distribution, and they have 7 or 8 larger customers. And then they have some number, 10, 20, 30%. And this isn't like a $5 or $6 million MSP that are spending less than $2,000 a month. And the first thing I think to myself is they can't really be doing all the things we're talking about.
Right.
Like at that, regardless of whether they have 10 users put seat price aside, right?
Yeah.
Think about just some of the things we talked about this week and last week with, impact analysis. And then these kind of conversations about readiness. You really can't afford to do it for clients that are spending $1,200 a month. And that's the reality of it. And maybe there'll be small MSPs that only do that and build a model. But if you're a $3 to $10 million MSP, you just have to say, you can't have all your customers prepared like that.
Right.
And that's a tough pill to swallow.
No, I agree. I mean, it is. And I think you would work yourself to death if you tried to solve that problem. I mean, we talked about standards, but there comes a time where you're going to have a segment of your clients that it just doesn't make any sense economically or financially to you to try to have processes to do all those little things like you talked about, because it's just going to be a big time suck, which means a huge financial suck.
I know an MSP that recently had this issue. They have about 110 clients, and they went to 40 of them and said, listen, we can't continue to do business unless you do these things at this price. And if not, we'll help you find someone else. Of those 40 clients, 25 of them chose to go find another way to do it, but they increased their recurring revenue for that cohort by about 10%. So that cohort had 10% more revenue with, a third of the customers. And that's the kind of things we need to be doing. And maybe somebody else is set up to secure those other customers. Like they're geared to that. But we have to know where we live and what it takes to get everybody there.
Yeah.
I agree.
Really, really good stuff, Gary. I know we're down to 2 minutes, Gary, but maybe before we thank everybody, a few weeks ago, you said, in sales, you're looking to figure out why you don't want to come back to a second meeting. So I was just curious with this incident, again, it's more about, as Chris said, disaster recovery than it is a cyber. But any thoughts on positioning if you were in front of a customer or prospect here that you'd get them to, figure out if they were sleeping at a 1 to 10 scale, as you put it, or like a baby, or
I think similar to what Matt was saying, but in our world of how we talk to customers about what their BIAs look like and a sample of one, rather than just saying, do you do these kind of things? Do you have a sample of that I could see? Like having 5 or 6 questions that tell you, would they have been prepared for this type of an incident? And then be able to use this incident. It's the perfect one because it's not a cyber attack, but it has all the characteristics other than it got solved quickly of a mass attack. And so I think it's a really safe one. to be able to use. And if you build on all the things that we've seen happen, Andrew, and brought up over the past few years here, and now you add this one, it really builds a great conversation to be able to have customers see their risk clearly. And again, if you weren't on last week, you didn't listen to what we talked about with BIAs, go back, because to me, that is step one. Customers can't make decisions if they haven't thought through what's important and what would happen. Like, how are they going to assign risk if they haven't gone through that process?
Yeah.
Like, and then you're blaming them that they don't want to spend money. It's hilarious.
That's a really, really good point, Gary. Way to kind of close things out for today. With that, Matt, thanks. Really, it was great having you on, and we'll have you back. You really were fantastic in articulating, and Kate brought up some really interesting points that made me think differently about how we'd ask questions. So thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, Chris. Always awesome having you with us. Everybody out there, again, Phyllis, Gary, as always, appreciate you guys joining every week. We'll look forward to seeing you all next Monday, and make it a safe one, happy and healthy one. Take care, everyone.